So I'm going to start out today by walking through some preliminary frequently made mistakes that I've seen from folks who have asked me questions or submitted their code for review so far. And this is a much more complicated assignment than the previous ones, so it's not surprising that there's more complicated mistakes. So let's talk through some of the things here. So let's start by taking a look at crawl page async. Thing to remember here is don't use page future then compose. What you want to do is just call images on page and page links async, and you want to pass in page future as the first parameter. So you want to skip all this stuff. It's unnecessary to do that. But instead you want to call this, I'm not quite sure what was trying to be done here, but it's too complicated and not correct. So it'll blow up. The test cases will flag that as being incorrect. Down here in the getPageAsync method, you're supposed to call supplyAsync. That's the factory method that's used to kick off some processing asynchronously. You don't need to pass in fork join pool, common pool here, because if you omit that second parameter altogether, it'll default to using the common fork join pool. Now, this isn't wrong. It's just more verbose than it really needs to be. Let's take a look down here. Now we're in images on page async. And this has way too much extra code. This code here should just be replaced with a single method reference to a helper method that's defined further down below in the file. So if you look carefully, you'll see there's a helper method that basically does this. You can remove this stuff and just call that as a method reference. And then down here, please also pass in a method reference here rather than doing the Lambda expression. So that method should be the images on page async method should be very short and have two calls to methods that will pass method references and run them asynchronously. Let's take another look at this. This is another set of things incorrect about images on page async. So don't use then compose, but instead use then compose async, or I'm sorry, then apply async followed by then compose async. And as we said before, all of this stuff is way too complicated and should just be replaced with the appropriate method references as outlined in the previous discussion. So this code will be a lot more concise. Now let's take a look at images on page links async. And down here, again, you want to be using then compose async here instead of then compose. The main difference is then compose async will process do the processing in a separate thread, which is what we want to do here. We want to have things running asynchronously and concurrently in the context of the common fork join pool. Now let's take a look at crawl hyperlinks on page. You don't need this call here. You don't need this call here. And don't pass +1 here, but instead crawl page async will do the proper updating of the depth by 1. So this code can be made more concise. Don't need to do some of this extra stuff. Here's process images async. And again, there's too much complexity. As a general rule of thumb, you'll mostly notice when I write code, be it Java Streams code or Java Streams code using completable futures, I try to factor things out as much as possible to avoid having very complicated behaviors. So I usually try to have a method reference or a very simple Lambda expression instead of having a bunch of code nested here. It just makes it a little cleaner to see it at a glance. So again, all this stuff should go away and be replaced to a call to a helper method that's defined further down in the file. And then down here, this is also way more complicated than it needs to be. You simply need to use collect with the appropriate collector to do the collecting. And interestingly enough, the person had done it correctly in the previous implementation of crawl hyperlinks on page. So this is extra work that doesn't need to be done. So those things should be folded in and cleaned up. Let's take a look at transform image async. So there's no particular reason to have a null check here. You can remove that. And this call doesn't need to be here at all. You don't need this map call at all. You can do other stuff, or you don't need to have it be done in this form here. That's more extra work than you need. And then here's transform image, and I think that's the last one. This implementation is way too complicated. it should be very similar, not identical perhaps, but very similar to what was done in assignment 3B. And I think the walkthrough video actually mentions that. You should use it. I think there might be an extra parameter or something like that, but it's very similar. So all this stuff can be cleaned up. And this is also something that can be cleaned up by just having a single terminal operation down here. So that's the walkthrough of preliminary frequently made mistakes. Please make sure you take a look at this and update your code before you submit it. There are several people who've already submitted their code, which is great. I will start taking a look and giving you comments as soon as I can.